It's been more than 30 years since a Bucks County mother was murdered, and now justice may be a little bit closer.
On a Friday afternoon in April 1991, in a quiet working-class neighborhood outside Philadelphia, a 35-year-old wife and mother of two was murdered in her own home. Then, to hide the crime, someone set that home on fire. For more than 3 decades, her killer walked free. He raised a family. He held down jobs. He lived just a few doors away from the house where he allegedly took a life. This is the story of Joy Hibbs and the extraordinary, decades-long fight to bring her killer to justice. Croydon is a small, tight-knit section of Bristol Township, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The kind of place where neighbors know each other, kids play in the street, and everyone assumes the worst things happen somewhere else. In 1991, Joy Hibbs lived there with her husband, Charlie, and their 2 children on Spencer Drive. By every account, she was an ordinary suburban mother, living an ordinary life, the furthest thing from someone anyone expected to become the center of a 31-year murder investigation. That ordinary life ended on April 19, 1991. Sometime that Friday afternoon, while her family was away, someone entered the Hibbs home. Joy was killed inside. Afterward, the house was deliberately set ablaze. Investigators would later conclude the fire was meant to destroy evidence and disguise what had really happened. When firefighters and police arrived, they weren't just looking at a house fire. They were looking at a crime scene that had been partially erased by flame. Investigators didn't have to look far. A neighbor just a few doors down, a man named Robert Atkins, quickly became a person of interest. According to testimony that would only come to light decades later, Atkins's then-wife, April, said that on the afternoon of the murder, her husband came home in a state that alarmed her. His clothes, she said, were dirty and appeared to be stained with blood. When she asked what had happened to him, he gave her an answer, one that, at the time, she chose to keep to herself. She would later testify that he told the family they needed to leave town, and that he washed his clothes and showered before they did. For years, she said nothing. She has said fear kept her silent. But here's the detail that would make this case infamous. Not just as an unsolved murder, but as an alleged failure of the system meant to solve it. Robert Atkins, it turned out, was working as a confidential drug informant for the Bristol Township Police Department. For years, the investigation into Joy Hibbs's murder stalled. Atkins remained the primary suspect, but no charges were ever filed. The case grew cold, not forgotten by the family, but seemingly shelved by the system. In 2014, a blog post brought new attention to the case, publishing what would become the only known media interview with Atkins himself, and publicly naming him as a suspect for the first time. That same year, the case was reassigned to Bristol Township Detective Michael Slaughter. Slaughter dug back into the file. What he found troubled him. Word within the department, he would later say, was that Atkins had been protected, not because of insufficient evidence, but because of his usefulness as an informant. Slaughter has said he was told to back off the case, instructed, in effect, to leave Atkins alone. He didn't accept that. In his own words to reporters years later, he said there is no version of cop math where a murder suspect gets a pass because he's useful as a snitch. You never trade a murder suspect for a drug informant, full stop. By May 2016, Slaughter submitted his findings on the case to the Bucks County District Attorney's Office. And then nothing happened, not for years. To Joy's family, there was only one way to read that silence. Her son, David Hibbs, later told reporters that he believed the case had been deliberately buried, that authorities looked the other way and covered it up. For 3 decades, Charlie Hibbs and his children lived with an absence that never resolved into an answer. Joy was gone. The man they believed was responsible was still living freely in the same community, sometimes practically around the corner. Grief without resolution is its own kind of sentence, and the Hibbs family refused to serve it quietly. In November 2021, Charlie Hibbs, by then 68 years old, and his son David, did something that would change the trajectory of the case entirely. They offered a $50,000 reward out of their own resources for any information that could finally lead to an arrest in Joy's murder. It worked. The reward reignited public and media interest in a case that had gone quiet for years. And this time, the Bucks County District Attorney's Office reopened the investigation in earnest. Detective David Hanks was assigned to the case in November 2021. 6 months later, the effort had produced what 3 decades of prior investigation hadn't: a recommendation from a Bucks County investigating grand jury to formally charge Robert Atkins with first-degree murder. On May 18, 2022, 31 years after Joy Hibbs was killed, Robert Atkins was arrested and charged with her murder. Investigators alleged that Atkins, who had lived just a few doors from the Hibbs family, killed Joy, stole from her home, and then set the house on fire to cover up what he had done. At a news conference announcing the charges, then District Attorney Matt Weintraub didn't mince words. He said Atkins had spent the past 31 years living free, but on borrowed time, and that the debt was finally coming due with interest. The break in the case, prosecutors revealed, came from April Atkins Roberts' ex-wife. She testified before the grand jury about what she says he told her that day in 1991, that he had stabbed someone and set their house on fire. She described him coming home covered in blood, washing his clothes and showering, before telling her to pack up the kids because they were leaving for the Poconos. For decades, she says, fear kept that account locked away. When she finally spoke, the case moved forward in months, after sitting dormant for years. The Hibbs family had waited 3 decades for this moment. In a statement read at the press conference, they described grief and suffering that 3 decades could not erase. Atkins's case moved through the courts for nearly 2 years after his arrest, working through preliminary hearings, pretrial motions, and delays common to a case built on decades-old evidence and testimony. At a preliminary hearing in September 2022, prosecutors laid out the foundation of their case in open court for the first time. Atkins, dressed for what would become a long legal fight, was escorted from the courthouse after the hearing, a visible marker of just how far the case had come from its cold case origins. In early 2024, more than 3 decades after Joy Hibbs died, Robert Atkins finally stood trial. It was a 4-day bench trial, meaning the case was decided by a judge, rather than a jury held in Bucks County Common Pleas Court, before Judge Wallace H. Bateman, Jr. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jennifer Shorn and Chief Deputy District Attorney Kristen McElroy, built its case around the physical evidence collected at the scene decades earlier, the fire investigation that pointed to arson, and crucially the testimony of April Atkins about what her then-husband told her the day Joy died. The defense, led by attorney Craig Penglisay, worked to limit what April Atkins could testify to. Under the judge's rulings, she could only speak to certain conversations with her ex-husband. Unless the defense opened the door by attacking her character, a door the defense ultimately chose not to open. Reporters covering the trial also raised a pointed question. Had Atkins' original alibi from 1991 ever really been checked? At a news conference following the verdict, Weintraub offered a measured answer, suggesting that investigators at the time may not have scrutinized it as thoroughly as investigators would decades later. It was about as close as any official came to publicly acknowledging that the system had failed Joy Hibbs the first time around. On February 1, 2024, Robert Atkins was convicted of first-degree murder and 2 counts of arson in the death of Joy Hibbs. Inside the courtroom, more than 3 decades of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions collapsed into a single word: guilty. Chief Deputy District Attorney Kristen McElroy called it a powerful moment, one the family had spent a lifetime working toward. The following Friday, February 2, 2024, Judge Bateman handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for the arson charges. Robert Atkins will spend the rest of his life in prison. Joy Hibbs' family will spend the rest of theirs without her. This has been the story of the Joy Hibbs case, a reminder that some families never stop fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes to find it.